Welcome back everybody. Today we're doing recommended settings, but we're going to find out the real recommended settings because the dev have another idea what is the recommended. It should be the AMD Ryzen 7 5800X or the i7 12700, 16GB of RAM, a GPU of 8GB, meaning the RX6800 XT or the RTX3070. That is to play at 60 FPS at 1080p at ultra presets. From my point of view, recommended settings should be play at high settings. So we're going to find 1080p, 60 FPS, high settings. Welcome to Respawn PC. I'm Dunk. Let's game on. The quick and mini disclaimer: I'm playing on a fresh Windows install, the game, MSI Afterburner, and no junkware install. We're starting off with the AMD side of things: Ryzen 5 5600G, 16GB of memory, and the RX6700 non-XT. Obviously, we would want to find 1080p high settings and reaching 60 FPS. So we are at 1080p high settings, FSR quality, and we have a 62 FPS average. Depending on where you are on the map, you have some drop in the high 40s and in the low 80s in the less busy area. The GPU is pegged at 100% and using 6GB of VRAM. For the CPU side, we are using 48% of its utilization, meaning we can drop the CPU even lower. For the memory, we're using 12.4 to 13GB of memory. I know we may already find what the AMD GPU should be at high settings 1080p, the RX6700, but I want to test the RX6600, which should be about 1% better on paper than the RX57, and the card was already on my bench to test it anyway. Here's the result, the RX6600, and surprisingly enough, I got a worse result than the RX5700. I get an average of 56 FPS with all the same settings. The GPU is pegged at 100% using 5.6 to 6GB of VRAM. The CPU is in the mid 40s and the memory is at 12.5. So only the card is performing a bit worse than the 57. Even changing FSR to balance instead of quality, we only gain 2 FPS average, so up to 58. Let's get back to the RX5700 because we reach there's 60 FPS more for this GPU, but let's drop the CPU because we had a lot of headroom and drop to the famous Ryzen 5 3600, 2 gen back, both being 6-core 12 threads, beside having the integrated graphic for the Ryzen 5 5600G. The 5600G is about 3% more performance on paper, but in game it's a different story. We reach an average of 60 to 70% of utilization on the CPU side, compared to the mid 40 with the 5600G. We're getting close to have some core or thread reaching 100% of utilization, so I don't think we can go lower than the Ryzen 5 3600. So we found our recommended settings for AMD side of things: 1080p 60 FPS at high settings, not ultra. Here's the Ryzen 5 3600 with the RX5700 with 16GB of memory. Jumping into the Intel CPU and Nvidia GPU, we start off with the RTX3060. I have the 12GB variant, since the dev recommend the 3070 to play at ultra settings. 3060 should be a good start to find the high settings. So the 3060, 12GB at 1080p high settings. Do we reach 60 FPS? Yes, we are averaging 77 FPS. We can go even lower in terms of GPU. In terms of CPU, my Intel i3-12100F is comparable to the i5 11600. Besides having 6-core 12-thread and 4-core 8-thread, the i3 is similar in performance, a bit lower. For this game, expect a lower CPU utilization with the i5. Having more core, this game will have core and thread. For the i3, I won't go lower because we're using 70 to 60% of utilization. Going higher mean we're close to get the CPU bottleneck. Now dropping one gen, the RTX 2070, similar in performance as the 3060, but a bit worse on the DLSS side of things. We get an average of 71 FPS. We are still quite a bit higher than the target 60 FPS to play at 1080p high settings, so we're going to continue dropping the GPU because you can clearly see that GPU have some headroom to have higher settings, using 95 to 97% utilization and only 5.2GB of VRAM. So there's some ultra settings you can implement with that GPU. But we are staying at the preset of high, so let's jump lower. Dropping just a little bit, the RTX 2060 gives us a nice FPS, a 69 FPS. And beside having a nice FPS, the GPU is where it should be, using almost 100%, almost back at 100%, 5.2GB of VRAM utilization, the CPU is okay, and the memory is at 13. So we can clearly state that the heavy RTX variant of NVIDIA GPU can play this game at high settings, 1080p, and be able to play at 60 FPS. I don't have any RTX 2050 from a laptop, but at least the desktop variant of the RTX, they all capable. That means we drop in the GTX series of GPU of NVIDIA, and after before the 20 series of RTXs was the 16. The highest being the 1660 Ti, which I have on in my laptop, so it's a mobile variant. So the desktop would be the 1660 Super that I have on hand. And it was a fail, because we're averaging a 40 FPS at 1080p high settings. We also lose DLSS, dropping to the GTX series, meaning we need to use FSR. And even with FSR, the card is not able to reach a 60 FPS. And not only that, the 1660 series only have 6GB of VRAM, and we try to keep the 8GB which the dev recommend for the ultra settings, but for high settings in our situation. But that's okay. There's higher performing GTX in the series, like 1080, 1070 Ti. Let's try that out. Next card will have been my GTX 1080 Ti, but for some reason, when I reach a 5GB of VRAM, the game crash. I think I have a bad VRAM on my GPU, and I decided to go down to my GTX 1080, which is completely functional and didn't crash. I get just 59 FPS. I'm just under the 60. So my guess is the 1080 Ti will have done the job properly. And that is with the FSR, obviously. The 1080 regular non-Ti play the game quite well and smooth. The GPU is back at 99%, using almost 6GB of VRAM. And for some reason, with this card, we're using almost 14GB of system memory. And if someone is looking to sell their GTX 1080 Ti, I'm willing to get it. If you have a PayPal account and willing to ship to Canada, just comment or leave me a DM. And just to test it, the last NVIDIA on that video is the GTX 1070 Ti. I have the Cerebrus model from Asus. It runs the game quite well. We are pegged at 100%, obviously. And if you tweak a bit the settings, you may be able to reach 60 FPS or higher. Because right now we are averaging 56 FPS, a bit lower than the 1080 non-Ti. Or if you drop the FSR from quality to FSR balance, maybe you'll get a few FPS to be able to get your stable 60 FPS. Or if you just want to crank the FPS higher, just drop to medium settings. And lastly, for the Intel GPU, I don't have to retest all the card. If you watch my video of Warhammer 40k Space Marine 2 with ARC GPU, it was the A750, my Elden Ring edition, that was able to play at 1080p high settings to have a 65 FPS. Yes, on that video I was using the i7 14700K, but compared to the i3 12100F, the i7 is only using mid 30% of utilization, so the i3 is still viable. Unfortunately, this time the A580 doesn't win this round, as it need to be at medium settings to get 60 FPS. So here's your list of winner to play at the recommend settings, which should be high settings, not ultra 1080p, to reach 60 FPS. On AMD we have the Ryzen 5 3600 with the RX6800 XT. For Intel CPU we have the i3 12100F or the i5 11600. For the NVIDIA GPU we have the GTX 1080 Ti. I'm pretty sure this is the one, because my GTX 1080 we just under at a 59 FPS. And for the Intel GPU it will be the A750. Thank you very much to come watching, and see you on the next one. And subscribe.